This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Folks, before we get into our interview with Patrick Newman for this week's episode, let me read these important announcements. Bureaucracy is both a weapon and a weakness for the modern state. While it regulates, spies on, and controls almost every aspect of our lives, it's impeded by its own incompetence and waste. As Mises warned in his book, Bureaucracy, the ultimate basis of an all-around bureaucratic system is violence. And as Murray Rothbard said, what bureaucrats and power elites always want is for the opposition to shut up and go away, to obey orders, to accept their assigned tasks. Well, we don't plan to shut up or go away. Join the Mises Institute on April 26th in Phoenix, Arizona, as we expose the danger and waste of bureaucracy. Dr. Robert Malone, Tom Woods, and Tom DiLorenzo will discuss the psychological operations and bureaucratic control, the madness of COVID-era public health, and the corruption and hypocrisy of our federal bureaucracy. Tickets are $100 for Mises members and $120 for non-members. Register now at Mises.org/Phoenix25. And here's your chance to win a free ticket. Enter the raffle at Mises.org/PhoenixRaffle25 by April 1st. Winners will be announced the week of April 7th. Hope you can make it. Patrick, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Bob.
Well, Patrick, I was reviewing the videos from the recent Austrian Economics Research Conference, and you were basically just the star of the show. Like, people couldn't get enough of you.
Wow, well, that's very kind of you. I hope it was at least. I didn't have too many tomatoes thrown at me during my presentation, so I take that as a success.
So why I have you here, besides your general talk where you were the sole presenter, is you were on a panel that Jonathan Newman had organized that was against MMT from various angles, is going to be part of what's planned to be a book project that I'm also contributing a chapter to, but I was not at the AERC to present on that panel. And it was intriguing to me, Patrick, because your topic was saying, hey, should government spending or G be included in GDP statistics? And that's interesting because Rothbard's written about that, but also it's in recent times like Elon Musk has raised it. So you want to maybe just explain why recently is this like a news hook, but then also then what you got into in your paper?
Yeah, sure. So the discussion of what's in gross domestic product and should government spending or government's contribution to total economic output, so to speak, should that actually be considered meaningful output and included in GDP, is for a long time since Murray Rothbard wrote about this in the early 60s, has been kind of considered a crankish libertarian position. Oh, this is something that just a bunch of fringe free market anarcho-capitalists advocate. But recently, since the beginning of the Trump administration, President Trump's second term, this has been in the news more. You have Elon Musk, who is he's the senior advisor to the president and is more or less in charge of DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. He's posted on X about this, that government spending should be included in gross domestic product figures. And we've also seen the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, also make similar statements. And this is big because as the head of the Department of Commerce, Lutnick, in theory, has authority over the statistics that the Department of Commerce releases. And GDP is one of the statistics that is released by the Department of Commerce through the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So this is a big thing. There's a lot of discussion about eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. And of course, as Austrians, we would say that, well, there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. In fact, it's entirely waste, fraud, and abuse. And in this session on modern monetary theory and the book project that's coming out, it's a collection of essays. I'm excited about that. I think it's very important. In my essay, I talk about the effects of, say, debt monetization or just simply printing money to finance budget deficits, how that would affect the structure of production. And I argue, like Rothbard, that it would just simply lead to an increased consumption spending because government spending is consumption, and that would cause higher interest rates and shorten the structure of production. In making my argument, I go through the discussion of Rothbard's accounting figure or the economic statistic that eliminates government's contribution from GDP. And I go through a bit of the history of thought, which I find it's very interesting because all of this is relevant. What Rothbard wrote about in the early 60s is relevant to today. And it'll be very interesting to see what the Department of Commerce actually does about this.
Okay, great. Yeah, a lot there just to unpack some of that and make sure we're not losing people at the outset here.
Yeah.
So the way I saw it come into the mainstream discussion, by which I mean like people were talking about it on Twitter as of a month ago or something, was I think it was the Atlanta Fed published an updated GDP forecast, like the Fed Now statistics or something. And it had gone, these numbers aren't perfectly right, but it was something like in February, it was, they thought there's going to be 2-point-something% GDP growth in the first quarter. And then like a few weeks into the Trump administration, all of a sudden they were predicting a contraction. And so people were, oh, look at this. And I think part of that was because they were building in forecasts of a trade war. But also, I think some of it was they were saying, hey, Doge is talking about all these spending cuts. And, and the way our model works, if government all of a sudden were to unilaterally just reduce its spending, then, that's going to cause measured GDP to go down. And that's what a recession is. And so it was in response to that then Elon Musk was chiming in and saying, this is kind of silly. And he came up with some thought experiment about, like, what if the car companies laid off a bunch of auto workers and then the government just hired them to go work at the DMV? And so he was saying, if you just naively count, I'm making his argument a little more rigorous than, what he banged out on Twitter. But the steel man of his position was saying that if you just count as, government giving salaries to people working at the DMV who presumably aren't making the standard of living higher for Americans, when before they were earning the same salary working at a car company, making cars, that it's kind of silly to treat those two numbers into the same footing in GDP when clearly, the first scenario is better than the second scenario. And so then, his point was, if the reason official GDP is falling is because we're cutting spending on things that aren't really doing anything for Americans, then, surely that's stacking the deck against us, and that's not a good metric of economic health, right? So that was his point. And then in response, as you say, Patrick, everybody was just piling on. And even, I don't know if you noticed this, but it seems like the people who have particular scorn for the Doge people are like center right, even like conservative libertarian types who are like tied to DC think tanks.
Yeah.
Like those people really want to come out and say, oh yeah, we're against government inefficiency, but we're scholarly and academic about it. We're not like these rubes who just, government bad, So anyway, they are all coming out to just make sure everybody knew how stupid Elon was. And no, this is violating the laws of logic, and government expenditures have a valid place in the GDP statistics. And then one guy, this last thing I'll say here, is he showed a correlation between the official, GDP and then the private components of GDP. And it was a very tight correlation. And he was saying, see, so, and anyway, that doesn't really prove. Anyway, my point is, even if everything Elon said were 100% true, you would still see that result statistically in most cases. So anyway, they just were kind of just talking in circles. So one thing I did was I pointed at the World War II period where in the official statistics from 45 to 46, GDP went down slightly because of a massive cut in government spending, and private investment went up 160% or something like that in 1 year. That was officially a recession year. Normally, private investment doesn't go up 160% when there's a recession. And even private sector overall consumption and investment went up 47% or something. So anyway, just kind of showing in extreme cases where it's driven by an exogenous cut in government spending. Yeah, that's okay for the economy. That doesn't, all of a sudden leave the average people helpless. So with all that context, I was amazed to see your presentation and learn of your paper where you're saying this isn't just some cranky Austrian thing, that even the developer of these GDP statistics, Simon Kuznets, had some serious misgivings about what do we do about the government's contribution, if any.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely the sort of the brouhaha on Twitter was in part the scholarly economists who are saying, no, that we need these. Now, if we're taking out government spending, we're making the statistics more partisan and they're less trustworthy. And I had thought that, well, actually, we might make them more trustworthy, right? If there was a disconnect between how people have been feeling about the economy over the past several years and these statistics, then maybe the statistic, I'm not saying it necessarily is the statistics' fault, but it's just something we have to look into. But so like this discussion, I first learned about this when I got into Austrian economics, partially through some of your writings about World War II and the myth of wartime prosperity and stuff that a lot of people were talking about around the financial crisis. That we think of World War II as being this enormously productive time for the U.S. economy, and that's how we recovered from the Great Depression, when in reality it was actually after the war that we recovered, because all of this wartime spending was really just military spending. It wasn't actually making people better off. And economic historians on our side, like someone like Robert Higgs, who has written about this, the myth of wartime prosperity, has gone into a little bit of the origins of GDP and the history behind this. But for my paper, I really tried to dig in, take a deep dive into the history of thought as to how these statistics originated and how did the government's contribution, how did it get included in GDP, or what at the time was known as gross national product, which is something we talk about if we want. It's quite interesting because Simon Kuznets, he had some serious qualms about how to measure government's contribution to the economy. And it's not so straightforward as how the government does it now, right? Which, if the government does it now, how the government does it now is just simply by how much they spend on final goods and services, right? It's not about how much people choose to spend on final goods and services, right? And this is a big issue, and it's quite. I was quite surprised to see Kuznets make some sort of quasi-Austrian arguments in the debate with Department of Commerce officials, which unfortunately, as I'm sure everyone could guess, he lost out on.
Yeah, so let me maybe just give a little more of the context and what I want you to do in this episode here, because we have highbrow listeners of the Human Action Podcast, is to get into the weeds with this stuff, because it did take it further than like I had known about. I had read Higgs and I read Rothbard, but you brought up some stuff that I wasn't aware of, these controversies and how like the internal arguments of the FDR's administration and whatnot when this stuff was all getting banged out. But big picture, just to make sure people understand that, like where this come from theoretically, and like why would standard economists think that, oh yeah, government expenditures. And so as Patrick said there, strictly speaking, it's not just government spending, right? So Social Security payments right now are not included as part of GDP because that's considered a transfer. So the idea is that when you're trying to measure economic output, we're actually trying to gauge production, right? It's gross domestic product, how much stuff is produced. And as Patrick says, it's final goods and services, right? So if a used car dealer just sells the car, they don't count the full value of the car. They just count like, the additional services provided by the dealer as an intermediary. Whereas a brand new car being sold, that gets fully counted into GDP for that period. And so the idea is that it's easier to measure spending just we have better statistics. And so the idea is, oh, well, all the stuff produced is bought by somebody or it can go into inventory and they have that adjustment. And so if we could just measure up all the total spending on final goods and services, that's the way to get these numbers. And so then you run into the aggregation problem. Like, what does it mean to measure, like, how many total cars and apples and diapers did you make this year? If you're comparing two different economies, like, well, those are different units. So the obvious common denominator is to put it in money terms. So that's why they measure all the spending. But again, it's the idea is for government's contribution to that, they want to say, well, it's government spending. Like if the government's buying tanks, yep, that's GDP. But if the government's, again, just given to Social Security beneficiaries or, food stamps or whatever, that's not GDP because that gets caught, when they go spend the money and buy stuff. And so the theory is, well, yeah, I mean, if one household spends $10,000 on something and another household spends $10,000 on something else, they both had access to those goods, and there's competition or whatever thing. They had voluntary choice. And so what else could you do except to say both of those decisions mean GDP went up by $20,000 because of, those things. And so you kind of have to put them. And so then the issue, though, is, well, wait a minute, does that argument flow through if government officials approve spending $10 billion on fighter jets? And again, this isn't just some libertarian, oh, I don't like the government. It's just, as Patrick's going to explain here with Kuznets, who, the guy was not a minarchist by any stretch. Certainly wasn't an anarcho-capitalist, but he was just saying, the logic by which we could say lump in all expenditures and say, well, $10 of GDP is $10 of GDP, and you can't get in there and wonder about, are cigarettes good or bad for you? You got to kind of lump it together. But yet there is something qualitatively different if government officials are the one, with the expenditures. So do you want to explain what Kuznets' hand-wringing was over?
Yeah. So when Kuznets had created the first national income statistics in sort of a one-time service for the Department of Commerce, this was after the worst of the Great Depression. By 1934, the bottoming out had occurred, and the government was trying to figure out, okay, how much did output decline? How much did living standards decline? So Kuznets creates these national income statistics, and he's able to measure how much consumers value various goods and services by how much they're willing to pay, right? The market value, the price times the quantity, right? But from the outset, he recognized that there were conceptual problems with measuring government's contribution, right? And he said the first problem is that there's no profit and loss. There's a lack of a profit motive, right? Which encourages businesses to produce goods that consumers are willing to spend the most amount of money on. That's not what the government does. That's not how the government's motivated. And the government also collects money through what he called, say, like a fixed payment, right? Or a assessment, like a tax, right? And it's not a voluntary price that, consumers could choose to pay or not pay, right? You go to the grocery store, you buy deli meat, right? Or you could go to the grocery store and you choose not to buy deli meat, right? That's not how taxes work. And Kuznets struggled with how to measure government's contribution. He basically said there were two ways we could do it. One of them was the cost principle, what he called the cost principle, which is how much the government spends, right, on final goods and services. How much they spend on employees, on other factors of production, and so on. And then there's what he called the payment price principle, which is how much revenue the government collects from people, right? Assuming it's sort of a payment for the final goods and services the government produces, like a tax revenue. And he said that these were basically two evils, right? Neither of them were great, right? They both had their conceptual problems. The payment price principle approach, measuring government's contribution according to tax revenue, has problems due to basically the fact that tax revenue is not the same as business revenue, right? One of them is consensual. One of them, consumers can choose, to pay or not pay. The other one, the tax, is clearly forced. And the cost principle also suffers from some issues. He initially had stuck with the cost principle. That was what he used in his first study. But then several years later, he said that, wait a second, this could be a problem, because what if the government's running a deficit, right? Mm-hmm. Which is something that had really started to happen in peacetime in the 1930s with FDR's New Deal. And then he thought that, well, now how much we spend, there's a big difference between that and how much revenue the government earns. And he basically went back and forth, where by the time of World War II, he had ended up sticking with tax revenue, saying that we should measure government's contribution according to how much tax revenue it collects, more or less. We go into the specifics of the types of taxes. And this is an important point. Of course, we're going to get into the World War II story, but this is already very different than how the government measures its own contribution now.
It's interesting that back then, especially like you say, during peacetime, it was basically the governments were supposed to run balanced budgets. And so it's just interesting that he was like, well, conceptually, how much the government takes in revenue and how much it spends, it's kind of the same. Oh, wait a minute. What if it spends more than it takes? You know what I mean? Whereas now it's like, well, yeah.
Yeah. Like that's just normal business. But back then that was a big deal, right? You only really ran budget deficits during a wartime. At least that's when you were supposed to do it. But it was when I first read that, I'm like, oh, well, that's just totally normal right now. Right. But so.
And again, just for people, they would run surplus. So yes, they would run up debts during wars, but then they would run surpluses afterward, right? Because the idea, it was like the government was a giant business. And yeah, businesses can issue bonds or whatever, but you can't just perpetually keep going deeper and deeper into debt, the idea was. So
yeah. And the other point to mention, a minor point, is that the federal government spending, or just government spending, was a much smaller share. It was of the economy, before the 1930s, and then the 1930s, and especially World War II, it had really started to creep up, right? And that had kind of affected the calculus, because it's like, well, government spending so much, well, clearly it's got to have such an outsized influence.
Yep. Okay, so then do you want to take the story into what happens when we go into World War II?
Yeah, so the World War II story, I think, is really interesting. So most listeners on this podcast are familiar with what we had briefly spoken about before, where the myth of wartime prosperity. The World War II did not get the United States out of the Great Depression just because the government was spending a lot of money on tanks and weapons and drafting soldiers and making bombs and sort of stuff. That wasn't really output that consumers valued, like other goods and services on the market. It was really only after the war that we saw the private sector recover and the economy really truly recover. What's interesting is, sort of, when I was looking into this, is that there was a bit of a controversy between Kuznets and the Department of Commerce, right? Because Kuznets had written this important study. I think it was called something like National Income and Its Composition. It had come out in 1941, and this was him kind of looking back on his research and that he had done in the 1930s on how to measure, the overall size of the economy. And that was pretty big stuff for the time, right? Because it was just new statistics. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor happens, and then we enter the war shortly thereafter. But for the longest time, at least not really for the longest time, but in the run up to Pearl Harbor, the United States government, the FDR and the Roosevelt administration had tried to kind of mobilize for war, get us prepared for a conflict that might happen. But Congress was reluctant to approve all the expenditures that, say, various alphabet soup bureaucracies in the executive branch wanted to get. They wanted these appropriations approved, and because Congress was looking at some of these national income statistics that Kuznets was producing and saying, well, this is going to impose too big of a burden. So World War II happens, and right after the government, the United States government, we enter the war. So in early 1942, the Department of Commerce produces new national income statistics, which they call gross national product, right? And the main difference between GNP and Kuznets' national income statistics was that now all government spending on what they had considered final goods and services would be included, right? And the history behind this is actually really interesting, because Milton Gilbert was head of the relevant part of the Department of Commerce, who had issued these statistics, and his cousin was Richard Gilbert, who was the director of the Defense Economic Section of the Office of Price Administration in Civilian Supply. So we're going to have a quiz at the end of this podcast. We've got to make sure everyone knows that. And Richard had been trying to get Congress to approve war mobilization, but he had failed. And Richard was a Keynesian, and he had convinced his cousin Milton that it's like, look, we got to, I know you were close with Kuznets, but we got to do something different, right? We got to make the denominator bigger. In other words, since these statistics came out, and they showed that, well, the United States economy, we can handle all of these wartime expenditures, right? And they were designed, gross national product, that statistic was designed explicitly to make the burden of war mobilization seem less of a burden, right? And I just certainly found that interesting, and Kuznets had accepted the change for war because he had said, well, okay, war is essential. This is a fight for the nation's survival. So it's like, okay, this makes sense. But it was after the war that there was a big sort of brouhaha. And I don't know if there's anything you want to add to this before jump into this. I don't want to.
Yeah, again, let's just make sure people are getting the big picture here. So, again, putting aside your libertarian thoughts on this stuff and evaluations and gut reaction, but just like let's say you're a regular person who thinks like, oh yeah, the government's got to have like a fire department or something. You don't even conceive of could there be fire prevention services or that are privately supplied. And so even if you think that's totally vital function of the government, and yet obviously the firefighters have to get paid salaries, and there's got to be fire trucks that cost money, but still it's not obvious. Like, how would you quantify the output of the fire department in your local city with the output of the grocery store down the street from it or whatever, right? So it's and as Patrick was saying, there's two obvious things you could say. Well, how much does the fire department spend, or how much does it get allocated? And then the difference would be turning up if they were allowed to run a deficit, right? So you can see how the government as a whole. But the critical point is you could have two cities side by side. They both have fire departments, and in one of them, maybe everyone's just lounging around, and half the fire trucks actually have flat tires and things like that, and they have identical budgets. And so the point is, like, it's not obvious that just the amount of expenditure or what their line item is in the budget and whatever, it's not clear how do you measure if they're really providing goods and services that the community values and that should be put on a similar footing as the grocery store that has a similar amount of payroll or something for its employees. So that, because again, the point is, if there is a grocery store where all the employees are lounging around and you go in there and all the shopping carts, half of them, the wheels are broken, people are going to stop going to that grocery store. And so, that's why it is a decent metric to look at, like, the net profit or the revenues or whatever of that grocery store to get an idea of how much service is it providing to the community, how big a footprint is it in the economy, because if it's not up to snuff, it'll go out of business, whereas there's nothing that's going to make the fire department go out of business. So that's kind of the issue. And so then, Patrick, what I thought was intriguing about your story is you're saying it's not that, oh yeah, just kind of a happenstance and the way they calculate the government statistic or GDP, such that by definition, by construction of the formula, if government purchases of goods and services goes up, then automatically GDP goes up dollar for dollar. And hey, that could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. I guess it depends. You're saying that wasn't just a statistical thing. Like, they intentionally, the reason for that adoption was precisely to justify all the huge expenditures that were going to be necessary for war mobilization.
Yeah, exactly. It was designed to make it seem as though the war would impose as harsh of a burden. And bear in mind, playing devil's advocate from the perspective of the economists who would agree with, say, the Department of Commerce method over Simon Kuznets, they would say, well, yes, this is a more accurate representation of the economy, right? So it's like this is proper. Of course, other people would disagree, and as you mentioned, just to really kind of hammer this point home, it's the issue of the fact that the government does not run on profit and loss, right? GDP doesn't measure businesses' productivity by how much it spends, because if the business spends more on its factors of production than it's the revenue it receives, it's actually a loss, and it's wasting resources. Right. The government, though, doesn't actually earn a profit or a loss, in the revenue, the tax revenue is divorced from its payments. And this is a point that Austrians and free market types make, but it's not just us, right? This was something that had been raised by Simon Kuznets. And one thing I didn't mention is he did win the Nobel Prize for his study on economic growth. So he wasn't a fringe figure. He was very important in the history of thought. In the history of macroeconomics. So by the time World War II was over... Well,
can you hang on, Patrick? Let me just if we just reinforce the point about the wartime spending stuff, because I did some stuff in my pop book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and New Deal, where I was going and digging up some of the stuff that Robert Higgs had done, his scholarly work that you alluded to, Patrick. So just make sure people understand. For one thing, it's typical for a lot of right-wing conservative types to say, oh, the New Deal didn't end the Great Depression, World War II did. Yeah. And you say, okay, so you're a Keynesian, which is fine. Maybe Keynes is right, but just, you think you're dunking on leftist Democrats by saying that. No, you're not. You're conceding that, oh, yes, big government deficit spending is what fixes depressions. It's just, the New Deal was too tepid. Okay, so but Paul Krugman agrees with you, just to make sure you realize if that's your point. So that's why, if that does make you feel awkward, then I would invite you to consider the perspective of like Robert Higgs or Patrick Newman and Bob Murphy. That the reason for saying that, like if you just look at the standard statistics, it looks pretty like a slam dunk case. That the GDP growth was awful. There was a double dip in the 30s. That in 36, 37 again, GDP collapsed. Real GDP, and unemployment spiked up again into the high double digits, and it was terrible. And it wasn't until the early 40s when the U.S. finally you started seeing rapid real GDP growth and unemployment came down. So, geez, guys, the numbers don't lie. And the point is that if you decompose the reason, quote, real GDP exploded, there was a twofold thing. That yes, government spending on battleships and tanks and paying troops salaries or whatever, that necessarily pushed up GDP, nominal, or GNP, I guess at the time, nominal, the way we would calculate that. But also, I don't know if this was on your radar, Patrick, the Fed was monetizing a lot of the debt necessary to do that. And so normally consumer prices would have gone up. And so if you were doing, quote, real GDP by saying, oh yeah, total expenditures on final goods and services went up such and such, but you know what? The prices of a basket of goods and services also, it was illegal for prices to go up. They had price controls. And Higgs reported they didn't account for that at all. And I even emailed him when I was writing my book. And I said, do you mean you don't think they adequately accounted for it, or they literally ignored that? He said they literally ignored it. So again, the Fed's creating boatloads of money to lend to, to buy government bonds. And then so that's fueling this huge deficit spending. So these government expenditures on war goods is pushing up. And if you look at the decomposition, it was like government spending got to be like 40% of the economy in the peak war years. So this is a huge factor. And normally that would have pushed up prices to, make real GDP not as big, but they just literally made that illegal. You can't raise prices. And so that made, wow, nominal GDP is going through the roof. Prices aren't going up too much. So yay, government. And then the last thing I'll say here on the unemployment stuff, Higgs pointed out and said, well, yeah, if you draft millions of men and send them overseas, that might reduce unemployment. And he showed it wasn't even 1 for 1. I don't remember the exact number, but it was like if they took a million men and put them on ships and sent them across the sea, the amount of unemployed did not go down by even 1 million. It only went down by like 800,000. So it wasn't even, you get what I'm saying? Like, so they were drawing people on net out of employment in the private sector. It was just that, they somewhat did reduce the pool of the unemployed. And so therefore, hey, the unemployment rate went down. That's awesome. Okay. So anyway, I get off my soapbox.
Oh no! I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned your book, Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression. That's how I had first learned of this back in high school when I had read the book, and it was like, oh yeah, because I was in my history class saying like, no, it didn't, it didn't get us out of the Great Depression. See, and yeah, we could. There's all sorts of funny statistics, including the government spending or how the Department of Commerce changed. The measurement of national, output statistics. That's only like the tip of the iceberg. There's all the funny business with prices and price controls, and then unemployment. Yeah, you would talk about workers getting, people getting unemployed, people just getting drafted, right, and all sorts of stuff. And yeah, so they you could argue they cooked the books, and it's unfortunate that this is old myths die hard, and that even many conservatives buy it. I think it is partially just because conservatives, some of them unfortunately have they're good, they're bad, they're against welfare spending, but it's the military spending, right? Yeah. That's the good part of government, right? And we need to increase that, and that's a old myths die hard, I guess, and yeah. So the World War II GDP figures, or what was known as GNP. They were a big change from, say, what Kuznets was producing before, and Kuznets had made the point that Austrian economists and libertarians and free market types have made, which is that when you're constructing the statistic like this, now if G goes up, GDP goes up, right? And this is also the point Elon Musk had made, but Kuznets had made this point. Right. It's not just fringe economists making this point. I mean, he'd recognized, and I quote his own statements on this, and I quote historians who've written about, who commented on this, saying Kuznets was cynical about this. And after the war, there was a very heated discussion because once Kuznets found out that it wasn't just going to be for wartime, this was going to be how the statistics would be done even in peacetime. Kuznets was very upset, and he said that this is it's like a fetish. It's like a sort of form of fetishism, and I don't know. I just thought that was a very descriptive word for this. But he made the point that, again, you've made, Higgs has made, and so on. It's that just because the government's producing a lot of stuff, right? We see tanks, we see soldiers, we see bullets, whatever, and then we could even extend it to just government infrastructure and so on. Just because they're producing a lot of stuff doesn't necessarily mean that society values it, right? And that was his central point, that he unfortunately had, he did not win that debate. The Department of Commerce had way more resources than Kuznets, and the Department of Commerce, of course, had a vested interest in increasing government's importance in the statistics because, again, they could get more money. The department could get more appropriations from Congress, and that means they can hire more economists and so on. And that of course is something that has to be mentioned. And it is just important. I just found it was so timely, this discussion, because literally these debates that are happening now references what was going on in the past. And we could talk about, government spending is controversial. Some people think that government's contribution is overstated in GDP, like Austrians. Then some people, like modern monetary theorists or other people, say it's understated, right? Mm-hmm. Environment stuff, income inequality, whatever. So this isn't just a fringe debate. This has literally been at the heart of macroeconomic statistics.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you made that point. And I want to make sure that we're emphasizing here that this is not merely like, oh, libertarians and your distaste for, like, even if you think it was absolutely essential for the, future freedom of the world that the U.S. government went into World War II and spent all that money buying tanks and battleships and, hiring troops and equipping them and whatever, or not paying salaries to troops. Hiring is not the right word. Drafting troops, then giving them some money after the fact. That's the point, though, is like, okay, but how do you assess, when you're measuring the economic output of two economies side by side, and one of them is cranking out battleships and aircraft carriers and things, and the other one's just cranking out cars and motorcycles for civilians? How do you compare those? And it's not obvious how you do it. And it could, like Patrick is saying, you could think that, it's vastly understating it. Like, for just spending whatever, $1 billion on military defense, we get effectively $100 billion worth of a flow of security services. And so, that you could make an argument like that, whatever. But the point is simply that the rationale for why you put spending by households and private companies on the same footing, dollar for dollar, just falls away when it comes to government services. So, Patrick, can you just circle back, though? I want to make sure I'm getting the point. Was Kuznets, did I understand, like, the way he thought the national income statistics should be reckoned was that he thought basically government tax receipts were the best proxy, but then in the war they said no, government expenditures, that was the issue. And so really the two are kind of similar if you have a balanced budget, but it's when there's or am I missing something? Is that too simplistic?
Yeah. So that's the basics of it. We could take a deep dive into then talking about the types of taxes, like, because then it gets into discussion over what is a final good or service that the government produces, and would like a business tax be a metric for intermediate goods, or would it just be, say, personal income taxes? And we could get into all that. I think it's probably a bit too in the weeds, but in so many words, that's correct. Kuznets said tax revenue is what should be considered. And Murray Rothbard had mentioned this in Man, Economy, and State and America's Great Depression when he was discussing these types of statistics. And he saw there was certainly more merit in Kuznets' position than in the Department of Commerce position. But Rothbard said that, well, this isn't still good enough because tax revenue is not like a voluntary payment.
Right. Okay. But, so yeah, is it, again, I know there's a lot of subtlety involved, and you're right. There's different, like a what do you call that? A toll on a road, especially like if there's free roads and then there's it's government owned and maintained and there's a toll, but people can choose to drive that because there's less traffic or something like that. Even though you might call that tax revenue, you can see how that's a lot closer to a private business charging a price than, just taking your money from you because, hey, your stocks went up and you sold some. And so you get hit with an income tax on the capital gain. So I get that there's subtleties, but just big picture, Kuznets is coming from the point of view that, in a sense, especially if there's periodic elections or whatever, that the public, if they're willing to tolerate a certain amount of taxation in exchange for this package of government services, you could argue, loosely speaking, the public is paying for those services. But then the issue is, if the government wants to spend more and they know, oh no, if we tried to raise tax revenue and fund all this spending with a balanced budget, the public wouldn't go for it. So instead, we're just going to go borrow money, have the Treasury issue bonds. Then it's like, well, wait a minute. Now, even that tepid link of the public was okay. Now it's, the people voluntarily lending money to the government. It's because they're going to get paid in the future out of tax receipts, right? So it's not like they care one way or the other about the flow of government services. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, they're not paying for the government services. They're just getting the yield on the Treasury debt. So the fact that they're willing to lend money to the government isn't them blessing what the government's going to spend the money on, right? And so, whereas again, if the government compares its tax burden with the government services and doesn't have a revolt or, vote somebody else in the next election, it's like, you're kind of tacitly approving. So is that, I get it's a lot more nuanced than that, but is that a rough cut of where Kuznets was coming from as to why tax receipts are a better proxy than government expenditures?
Yes. Yeah. That's more or less what he was getting at, right? He had said that, he had made the argument, well, we have to include government's contribution somehow. I mean, in his first writing, he's like, because the post office, right? And it's like, so there's the whole argument of like, okay, could private businesses do this? But then he used tax revenue.
Lysander Spooner has entered the chat.
Yeah. Because it was a rough, it's a rough measure of, in his mind, how much people value the government services. And in a balanced budget, it makes, it makes sense. Right. Or if a government runs deficits, but then they run surpluses. Okay, that makes sense. But as Kuznets had written about this and as this debate had unfolded, and he had pretty much lost by the late 40s, but he had kind of done some writings on this in the 50s and early 60s. It had become very clear that deficits were here to stay, at least the phenomenon of deficits, and then especially in later decades. But of course, government's elevated spending since the Great Depression was here to stay, and that has subsequently influenced all of our views on this. Because then we just take it for granted. Oh yeah, well, what the government spends, that's of course valued by the people according to that. How much the government spends, and if you disagree with that, well then you're backwards, right? You're ignorant, and that's actually not really how this how government's contribution was included. There was a vigorous debate. For anyone interested in the really arcane details, there was a serious debate. I cite the papers in my paper, and Kuznets and Department of Commerce officials were going back and forth at each other. Yeah,
great. Yeah, so folks, just so you are reassured, when the book becomes available, that's a collection of Patrick's essay, and then and others are going to contribute. I'll have Jonathan Newman, a different Newman, on to push the book and let you guys know it's available. So don't worry about that. Just as an aside, it was just something you said triggered a thought, Patrick, that it is amazing how much the economist's understanding and rationale or whatever framework for handling government budget deficits has evolved. Because like we said at the beginning of this episode, back on the classical gold standard, like governments were just considered like giant companies. And it was like, well, when is it okay, or when is it a good idea for a company to issue debt? It's like, well, if there's an emergency, or like a household, your kid's sick or something, you maybe got to borrow money, but then you pay it off. And so that was the it wasn't counter-cyclical fiscal policy, right? Yeah, and then in the post-World War II, 50s and 60s of hydraulic Keynesianism, they still had what they call it, like the business cycle balanced budget or something like that.
Cyclically adjusted, balanced budget.
And so the idea was the government would have a balanced budget over the course of the business cycle, so that when the economy's in recession, the government runs big budget deficits to help boost aggregate demand. But then on the flip side, when the economy's booming, the government should be running surpluses, partly to tamp down on the excesses, but also because, over the whole course of the thing, you can't just keep getting deeper and deeper into debt. You got to, and then that all went out the window too, such that, when Tom Woods and I were doing Contra Krugman, I mean, Paul Krugman would regularly write articles about how, if you run the numbers here, you can model it. And so long as the share of the government's deficit, relative to the economy is below a certain, like as long as the growth rate of the economy is higher than the yield on government debt or something like that, you could have deficits forever, right? Yeah. Just because that, you could run the equilibrium thing and just show that the government's total debt as a share of the economy stabilizes, and that's consistent with forever deficits as long as the share of the economy is fixed. And so it's just interesting how that just kept changing over time until now it's like, you never need to run a surplus. What are you talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. And I think a lot of economists don't know this because simply history of economic thought is something that is not taught anymore in graduate schools or is something that people are expected to know. It's just whatever is being done now. This is the latest and greatest method or whatever. And this is what people need to do. But definitely our economists' views of government's contribution to the economy have evolved in part because in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, government was a relatively small share and it was seen as sort of like a necessary evil. But then really beginning in the New Deal and after, government had a much bigger influence and a much bigger role. The government should build X, Y, and Z, or the government should take care of people's health. Or the government, we need to have troops, not just in the United States, but in other countries and so on. And I think, the whole thing, I was just thinking of this, it came to mind. It all hinges, I think, on the profit and loss discussion I had mentioned earlier. And most economists who were going to defend government's contribution, they are going to go off what's known as cost benefit analysis, right? Which is like, we don't actually get prices paid for what the government does, but we can estimate them, right? And that's how we can justify that this regulation will benefit the economy or this government spending will benefit the economy. And then it becomes a battle over cost benefit calculations and stuff. But really, it's all kind of fake. It's fake prices. It's not actually real prices paid. And this is just something that I think we could see something like this if we saw Elon Musk tweeting about, G should have been included in GDP. We're going to see something inevitably about, cost benefit analysis is really just smoke and mirrors, right? Which I think then would set off a chain reaction of revolt. Yeah.
Well, maybe in closing here, can spend a few minutes talking about Rothbard. So folks, in the links for this episode, I'll give you a link to the online PDF of the Scholars edition of Man, Economy, and State, which is Rothbard's magnum opus, in case you're unfamiliar with it. And in an appendix, so it's of that second edition of the Scholars edition, it's pages 1292 to 1295, where he's talking specifically about this, and he gets into like his concept of private product remaining and stuff like that. Do you get into that into your paper?
Yeah, I briefly discuss private product remaining in. For simplicity, Rothbard says you start off with GNP and you subtract the income originating in government, or in government enterprises. So it's basically like government employee salaries. You subtract that from GNP, and then you subtract whichever is greater, tax receipts or government spending, because whichever one's greater is the real burden, and then you get private product remaining. And that is kind of the share of sort of the market, what Rothbard would consider genuine economic output. So something that Kuznets never went that far. He had briefly kind of toyed with that at the beginning of his work on this, but definitely private product remaining is just sort of a more I view it as the logical extension of of counting government spending according to the tax revenue, because I think built into all this discussion, even Kuznets' analysis is like, oh, well, we have to include government's contribution. It's like, what would happen if we didn't measure the value of the post office or something like that? But as Rothbard shows, it's like, well, and Rothbard, of course, had this whole treatise on this, explaining how the market works and how the government doesn't work, and saying that, well, actually, government's productivity is less than is less than positive, right? Or it's 0%, or it could be, you argue, even negative. And this is going through, there's no profit and loss. It's a fixed payment. Taxes. It's they can forcibly block competition and all this stuff. And he creates these statistics, private product remaining. He applied it to the Great Depression. He didn't really do anything after that using the statistics, but some Austrians have. Robert Bate Marco kind of developed some of these statistics. There was a former Mises student who had kind of developed some of these statistics further on into to the present day. I think this is a great research project for an Austrian scholar or just someone interested in this, was to kind of create private product remaining, like a comprehensive view of it for the United States or for another country. I think that's something that someone should definitely work on. Maybe Doge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last one here. So I'll throw this out. Then if you want to comment on it, you can, Patrick, or you can choose to abstain. I remember when I was going through, I wrote the study guide to man, economy, and state, and something there, I didn't have time to really ponder it, but I wasn't sure if Rothbard was almost like double subtracting. Like, in other words, for sure, we get why the government's spending money on, a bunch of government employees doing something that should not count in GDP. But I wasn't sure. So, okay, so if you don't include that, then why would you subtract? You know what I mean? Like, in other words, yeah, certainly they're not contributing, but then it wasn't obvious to me. Do you then subtract it as well? So I get that their existence is siphoning resources away from what otherwise would have been private sector output. But if what we're trying to measure is what is actual private sector output right now, subtracting seems like, oh, you would have been subtracting from what would have been a bigger number, if you get what I'm saying. So anyway, that was...
Yeah, so you're mentioning why is Rothbard also subtracting the government salaries,
right? As opposed to just not adding it. I totally get why you wouldn't add it in there, but if
that's a good point. I think he mentions this in a footnote in America's Great Depression. It's I think he basically argues that it's based on tax revenue, right? And I do think there is some more analysis that should be delved into this. And bear in mind, the statistics Rothbard was using were not as clear cut as some of the stuff that the government issues now. But I think his argument is that, well, this is product that the government creates, but it's waste. So we need to take it out as well. And then we also need to take out whichever burden is bigger. I think he had mentioned that it is a slight overcounting of the burden, to the extent that the bureaucrats themselves, the government employees, they pay taxes. But I guess he said, there was nothing we could do about it. But it's definitely something that I think should be standardized. An Austrian could write about this. What's the appropriate way to do this? Is there any change if we do it one way or the other? And like I said, there's been some important kind of studies on this that I think should be continued.
Okay, well, that's a good place for us to wrap up. So again, folks, if you want to see Patrick's lecture at the recent AERC, we'll put that in the links, and we'll have Jonathan Newman on coming and promoting the book, the collection, when it's available. In the meantime, thanks, Patrick, for your work and the presentations, both of them that you gave at the AERC, and thanks for coming on here to tell us about what you did.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I hope everyone found this useful, and really excited about the anti-MMT book, and I'm excited for when it comes out.
And I think everyone at home is too. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.